Well, let's bring him on. It is the incredible, our presidential historian. Uh, it is John Rothmann, everybody. Welcome to the Mark Thompson Show, John Rothmann.
Thank you, Kim, and happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Hey, yeah, happy
I'm so
Thanksgiving
glad
to
we're
you.
going to I'm so glad we're going to talk turkey today.
We're going to talk turkey. Well, first of all, because you are a presidential historian, do you want to talk about the hostage first, or do you want to talk about JFK? I'll leave it up to you.
Well, why don't we do Kennedy first?
Okay.
Because I'm looking at the clock.
Mm-hmm.
I 60 years ago today was 5 blocks away from where I am now,
Okay.
and I am tremendously moved by the fact that 60 years have passed since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. For those of us who were alive on that fateful day, we will never forget where we were. And the impact of President Kennedy on all of our lives was so great. And it was a moment in American history which changed the course of all of our lives. And so today, I think it's good to reflect on the legacy of John F. Kennedy, what he meant to this country, and I think still means to this country.
It it's one of these days that everyone remembers exactly where they were, exactly what they were doing. Uh, I don't have those memories because I didn't exist yet. And I feel like I missed, this big part of our history. And I guess I'll never understand what that felt like. But looking back at who he was, his family life, it seems like, as President Biden said today, we lost somebody pretty amazing. And what could the country have been if he had not been killed?
Yeah, it's an alternative history.
Hmm.
What if he had lived? And the same thing can be applied to his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. All of these issues are real. I can tell you that President Kennedy had severe challenges that he overcame in the presidency. Perhaps his most stunning achievement was the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was able to turn a situation which could have become a devastating nuclear war into a moment of hope, because only a few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had the first nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. And although it's hard to understand how close we came on those fateful days in October of 1962, I can remember, Kim, my mother coming in to tuck me in at night and saying, "I hope I see you in the morning."
Oh,
So we were very fortunate. There are a series of recordings of what are called the XCOM meetings, and I did a night on KGO for 6 hours playing the XCOM tapes and having experts who were involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis to talk to our listeners about it. The other thing President Kennedy did was to herald in two important pieces of legislation, which passed, I hasten to point out, after his death. One was the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which was passed in the wake of his assassination. And the other was Medicare, which was passed after his death. But two monumental social programs which changed the nature of who we are and the way we live. John F. Kennedy was not viewed as a great president by many, but I believe that when one evaluates his record, it is clear why he is now ranked in the top 10 of America's presidents. And the most constructive achievement, of course, was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
yeah.
So I was not a Kennedy supporter. I was a Nixon supporter
Yeah.
in that campaign of 1960. But there is no doubt about the impact Kennedy had on all of us, and will continue to have as more and more is learned. By the way, he wasn't a perfect man. We know about all his affairs and so forth that somewhat marred his legacy. But on the other hand, we only elect a person, a man, or one day a woman, with all of their strengths and weaknesses. And I think Kennedy demonstrated far more strength than weakness. And had he lived, I believe he would have been reelected. His opponent probably would have been Barry Goldwater
Hmm.
in 64. But I want to tell a little story. Senator Goldwater actually told me this story, so it's worth repeating. He and Kennedy knew that they might well run against each other. And they agreed that if they ran against each other, they would campaign from the same plane, that they would hit a dozen major American cities and debate the issues head to head. Social Security, Medicare, foreign policy, civil rights. Uh, had Kennedy lived and had he and Goldwater proceeded with that plan, it would have revolutionized American politics in so many ways. I think the Kennedy assassination changed the course of American history in so many ways. And one of the things we have to remember is that his legacy is still there, still part of our lives, and means a great deal. And I would be remiss if I didn't say a word about Lyndon Johnson, because Johnson succeeded Kennedy on this very day 60 years ago. Most people dismissed Lyndon Johnson because he was viewed as sort of a joke, somebody who wasn't serious. And of course, no vice president can really be viewed seriously. But Johnson steered us through one of the most agonizing periods of American history. He did it with dignity and with grace. And I think one of the reasons why he is acclaimed today as one of America's most important presidents is because of that. Some of you will remember the interview I did with George McGovern. Remember, George McGovern was very much opposed to the Vietnam War, absolutely in 1968 took over the delegates that had been assigned to Robert Kennedy after Kennedy's assassination. And I asked George McGovern on KGO for his reflections on Lyndon Johnson. And he said to me, you know, John, what I'm going to say is going to surprise you. He said, I think Lyndon Johnson was one of the 5 greatest presidents of the United States. And I said, well, can you explain to me, Senator, why you believe that? After all, you opposed him. You vigorously opposed his policy in Vietnam. He said, John, take a look at the social legislation. Take a look at everything he did in terms of voting rights, civil rights, the environment, the question of, well, so many issues. And I would remind everyone, because I know you were talking about guns earlier, that in the aftermath of Robert Kennedy's assassination, and you can Google it and you can play the sound of 1968 Lyndon Johnson's speech on the question of gun control, in which he, a conservative Southern rancher who was very good with guns, by the way, and had a fine collection of guns, why he said it was time for America to have gun control. So the legacy of the Kennedy-Johnson years lingers and is still with us. And I thought I'd point that out. You cannot separate that. One other quick observation. It was exactly 60 years ago today when Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office. He was sworn in on Air Force One by Judge Sarah Hughes. She was a district court judge, federal judge. But Kennedy insisted that as she swore him in, standing next to him was Jacqueline Kennedy. She was still wearing the pink suit, blood splattered. And when Mrs. Kennedy was asked about that, she said, you know, I kept the suit on. I wanted to see people what they had done to us.
Yep.
And so there are many lessons. May I recommend a book that I think is still the best? It is The Death of a President by William Manchester. It was commissioned by the Kennedy family. I read it as I read it this morning, portions of it. I'm going to read the rest of it later on. It tells the story of November the 22nd, 1963, the days before, the days after, with such eloquence and such power. By the way, the Kennedy family was not happy with what William Manchester did because it was so personal. He really wanted to get all of the facts of what happened. And the book remains, I think, one of the greatest books ever written in this country. And if you've never read The Death of a President by William Manchester, it is well worth reading. On my shelf this morning, I pulled it off. I have a signed copy of that book, an inscribed copy from William Manchester. And it is an important book and one that should be read and reread.
Can you talk a little bit about Vietnam?
Yes.
And I understand, you know, the kind of how we were led into Vietnam and whether Kennedy had anything to do with that decision.
Kennedy is a very interesting person when it comes to Vietnam. He did not favor American intervention in Vietnam in 1954 in Dien Bien Phu when there were requests for support for the French. Kennedy was very leery of foreign policy involvement, but he and President Eisenhower during the transition period and talked about Southeast Asia. It's interesting. Eisenhower didn't talk about Vietnam. He talked about Laos because Laos really appeared to be in trouble. And there was a determination that America's national interest hinged on what happened in Southeast Asia. It was something called the domino theory. The idea that, just like in Europe, as each nation fell to Hitler, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, that eventually, like a row of dominoes, eventually, if we didn't stick it out in Asia, we would be challenged in the Philippines. We would be challenged in Hawaii. We would be challenged right here on the West Coast. Now, let me explain that the domino theory became something that ultimately was repudiated, but at the time seemed very valid. Remember, the Vietnamese government, the South Vietnamese government, was a product of the United States. We propped up No Dinh Diem. And by the way, I would remind you, one of the most tragic days of the Kennedy administration was at the beginning of November of 1963, when the American ambassador was Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who had been Kennedy's opponent in the senatorial campaign of 1952. Lodge was a senior Republican. He had been Nixon's running mate in 1960. Kennedy sent him to Vietnam so that the policy in Vietnam would be viewed as bipartisan. And in the opening days of November, with Lodge as our ambassador, the president of South Vietnam, President Diem, was killed, as was his brother-in-law, who ran the secret police. Kennedy was shaken by the fact that it was the CIA, in his mind, and the military, which organized that coup. And Kennedy himself gave the green light. He told Lodge, do what you have to do. It was a terrible mistake, and Kennedy regretted it profoundly. But it set us up in Vietnam because at that point, Johnson couldn't repudiate a Kennedy policy. And it's important to note that until March 2nd, 1967, in a dramatic speech in the United States Senate, Robert F. Kennedy supported Lyndon Johnson's policy on Vietnam. The opposition that really mounted came during the Tet Offensive in January of 1968, and of course, the candidacy of Eugene McCarthy, which was not a serious candidacy for many reasons, but became a successful effort by almost defeating Lyndon Johnson in New Hampshire. So when one looks back on the 60s and the legacy of Kennedy and Johnson, and really it was the Kennedy-Johnson administration, let me raise one other question, and that is the question which will, I'm sure, dominate the news today. Who killed Kennedy? Was it Lee Harvey Oswald? Was it a lone assassin? Was Kennedy killed in a conspiracy, either by the CIA or by big business? Or, well, you can go down the list of everybody who might have wanted to kill Kennedy. The mafia, of course, right up there on the top. The answer is that the Warren Commission did a thorough investigation, and they came to the conclusion that it was Lee Harvey Oswald, that there was no conspiracy. And that commission was made up of people like Gerald Ford, who was the last member of the Warren Commission to die, by the way, many years ago. But Richard Russell of Georgia. It was made up of liberals and conservatives, and there was no more incorruptible or more trusted figure by most Americans than Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the United States. I guess the bottom line is we will probably never know all of the things that went on. But I had the opportunity to interview a man who, by the name of Gerald Posner, I interviewed him on KGO, who was a real skeptic about the Warren Commission. And Posner wrote a book in which he concluded that, in fact, the Warren Commission was correct and that Kennedy was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. America will always question that. There will always be the question now that President Biden faces and President Trump faced before that about releasing documents that are now 60 years old and why some things remain classified. But the important element here is that since Kennedy's assassination, there has been a deep and abiding suspicion of everything the American government
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
The bottom line on all of this is John F. Kennedy does rank as one of the greatest presidents of this country because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, primarily. His legacy in terms of America was one of strength. I commend to everybody his book, Profiles in Courage, which he wrote with Ted Sorensen, who was his chief aide. And again, I had the opportunity to interview Ted Sorensen when he came through to the KGO studios. It was a time of absolutely fascinating moment. And if you really want to understand the Kennedy years, there are two books, one by Ted Sorensen and the other by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., which talks about the Kennedy years and which shed a lot of light on them. But of course, it was a long time ago, Kim. And as you point out, you weren't even alive then.
No, but a
And
lot of
so,
people were. So I'd love to share some comments with you.
please.
And then also a super sticker as well comment. Jim says, I was only 4 years old when he was assassinated, but I do remember people coming home to the house saying, did you hear what happened today? And people were crying and everything. Yeah. So a lot of people, that for them that sticks out. Ren says, and JFK was only the first of so many assassinations during our childhood.
Yes, let's remind
Yeah.
everybody after the Kennedy assassination came the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., then came the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, then came attempted assassinations, including the one against Ronald Reagan in
Yep.
1981. So you're right. We were far more innocent. Yeah, I think it was Pat Moynihan, who became a senator from New York and who I knew during the Nixon years, because he was on Nixon's staff, who said, we'll never be young again, and we'll never laugh again in the same way.
William writes, still vividly remember walking out of high school choir class to be told by crying friends that President Kennedy had just been shot. Cooper writes, I still have a record album of Kennedy's speeches that my mom bought after his death. She could never bring herself to listen to them, and it's still shrink wrapped.
May I tell you, I have a recording collection, Kim. I have hundreds and hundreds of LPs, and I have a whole section just on Kennedy. Actually, we used to be affiliated with ABC News,
Mm-hmm.
and I have a recording. It's 2 hours on an LP of the instant reaction when Kennedy died.
Oh.
And sometimes I will put it on the record player, which I still have, and just listen to it because you're hearing history. And one of the things I did this morning on the History Channel, they've been doing a series on Kennedy, and I watched it, and I listened particularly to the section on the Kennedy assassination. If you were not alive then, you can still hear it, and that to me makes it alive again, which
Right.
in a
Yep.
way is sad, but
Yeah.
true.
Chico Star says, Chico Shar rather, I was 5 and I remember my mom crying. And then Vilma has a powerful, old enough to remember. I remember thinking I might not be able to grow up.
Yeah.
I mean, what a,
Vilma's absolutely right. It was the end of innocence.
yeah.
We were never, the country never quite, it was one thing, let me just say, when Kennedy died in 63, the last president who died in office was Franklin D. Roosevelt, and that was on April 12th, 1945. But Roosevelt was 62 years old. He was in failing health. He had served 3 full terms and was into his 4th term as president. And although people were stunned by his death, it was comprehensible. But Kennedy
Mm-hmm.
was vibrant. He was
Young
alive. He was
family. Yeah.
young. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, the images of Jackie Kennedy, of Caroline, of John. If you were alive then, you will never forget the image of John F. Kennedy Jr.
Yeah.
saluting as his father's casket went by. I mean, these are the things that remain indelibly engraved upon our minds and hearts. One other quick note, when Caroline Kennedy, all grown up, came to the KGO studios and Ron Owens did the interview, but many of us were there, all of us were moved to tears because of that memory that we had of this little girl
Yeah.
who was deprived of her father. And I was on the air the night John F. Kennedy Jr. died in the plane crash.
So
And
sad.
it was interesting. It was, I was working the overnights. It was interesting to get the reaction of listeners who were absolutely blown away,
Mhm.
stunned. It was like reliving the death of a family member. Anyway.
Scott Rittenberg, speaking of books, he has a $10 contribution to the show. Thank you, Scott, for that. Thank you. Does Mr. R comment on the Canfield Weberman book linking the CIA and 3 Watergate burglars to JFK Triggerman, with Senator Gonzalez offering a forward?
Yeah,
I didn't-
I have to tell you, I read the book. I have a rather extensive library on the Kennedy assassination. And I will also, just so you know this, on November 22nd, 1973, I was on the East Coast. I spoke at Brandeis University that afternoon. That night, Mark Lane, who was the father of all the conspiracy theorists, and many of you will recall he was also at Jonestown, uh, was there, and I went to hear him speak. Uh, yeah, I understand all the conspiracy theories. I read somewhere we don't know where Richard Nixon was on November 22nd. We don't know where George Bush was, George H.W. Bush was
Right.
on November 20th. It's not true. We know exactly where they were. Kennedy, when Kennedy was killed, Nixon had been in Dallas, landed at JFK Airport, was in a cab going home, and heard the news. Actually, it was confirmed by the doorman at his building at 810 Fifth Avenue. And as for George H.W. Bush, he was in Texas, but he had nothing to do with the assassination. And he reports it in his own book. I mean, but conspiracy theories are something that take on a life of their own.
Yeah.
Do you remember the conspiracy theory that Barack Obama was born in Kenya?
The
I have
birther. That's a Trump thing, right? Yeah.
Well, no, it was pre-Trump actually.
Was it?
Trump promoted it.
He just
Trump
picked up on
promoted
it?
it,
Yeah.
but it was there's a whole book on it, and uh, people
Yeah.
asked me about that
No.
repeatedly when Obama was president of the United States. Yeah, but you're right, Kim. Trump promoted it actively.
Yeah.
Said he would prove that Obama was not born in the United States. But conspiracy theories are something people like to believe in. Let me also quickly just add the question of the CIA. There are a lot of people who believe the CIA was responsible for Kennedy's assassination. Uh, I just don't buy into it. And by the way, one of the people who was on the Warren Commission was John McCone, who was director of the CIA. It doesn't make sense. So my answer to you is I do not believe in conspiracy theories. By the way, the mafia, that whole idea that Sam Giancana and Kennedy were having an affair with Judith Campbell Exner at the same time. By the way, Judith Campbell Exner lived right near me. I used to see her at Calmart. She was a lovely woman. She lived on Broadway. But I mean, this is all absolute nonsense in terms of our belief system. So my answer is I don't believe that there was a plot by the CIA or by organized crime to kill John F. Kennedy. Do I accept the Warren Commission? The answer is yes. And by the way,
Okay.
that phone that rang probably was somebody who was yelling at me for saying this right now on the Mark Thompson, Kim McAllister show.
Let's move to this hostage deal, if we could. I kind of got a little pushback today. I can hear a bit of echo of myself. I hope no one else can hear that. Um, but read a comment from a listener, a woman that I know, because I had made the comment that it seemed lopsided that Israel only gets 50 hostages back out of some 200 or more that are being held, whereas Hamas gets 150 prisoners, so that the number was not equal there. And I was told that Israel is holding way more than 150 prisoners, and so I was wrong that it's not an equal deal. And then when I read that comment, others came and said, "No, actually, those numbers are wrong and that's not true." It feels often like when you're trying to get to the bottom of something or you're trying to understand something, no matter what you say on this issue, someone's going to be upset with you. And so it's almost like there's no discussing it. People are going to believe what they're going to believe. They have it in their head, what it is, and they're not looking for any information or to even entertain any other information. I don't know.
Let me answer you very directly. First of
Yeah.
all, I am delighted with this deal because we know now that women and children who were taken by Hamas are being released.
Hmm.
We hope. I mean, there could still be a glitch. It's not till midnight our time tonight when the deal goes into effect. At the same time, uh, there is no moral equivalency. There is no number equivalency.
Yeah.
For those of us who lived through the hostage crisis, 444 days during the Iran situation, the important thing is to reunite families.
Yeah.
I think the Israelis are trying to do just that. They're under tremendous pressure. And their feeling is that if they can release women and children and perhaps move to release more, but I want to remind everybody the release of the hostages does not obviate what happened on October 7th, the murder, the horrific actions, nor should we forget that even if 50 hostages are released, there will still be almost 200 people who are held captive by Hamas. One of the things that I hope comes out of this is the part of the deal we hear about, I don't know if it's true, that the Red Cross will be able to visit the other hostages.
Right.
But more than that, let me be clear. This is a tribute to the persistence of Joe Biden, who personally was involved in all of this and whose goal was the release of women and children and ultimately all the Americans who are being held hostage. There is no winner in all of this. This will not resolve the conflict between Israel and Hamas. This will not solve the broader problem of the right of Israel to exist in the minds of many Palestinians and the right of Palestinians to have their own state, which is something that many people advocate. This is not a solution. This is a temporary pause to try to achieve something better. I must tell you, I was particularly moved, and I'm watching this especially tonight. The father, whose daughter, Emily, was, he thought dead. And you may remember, I think we talked about it, Kim, that he said he was glad his daughter was dead rather than being held captive. Well, it turned out she's not dead. It turns out she may be one of the people released.
Oh, thank God.
And I'm thinking tonight or tomorrow, because it's going to happen over 3 or 4 days. It's not happening all at one time. Imagine when this father is reunited with his 9-year-old daughter and puts his arms around her, the blessing that will be. And yet I understood completely the contradiction. If someone I loved were being held hostage, maybe I would rather see them dead than tortured. That's the incredibly impossible dilemma of people like that. I had a rare privilege the other evening. I was asked to speak to about 100 young people, that is 20s and 30s, younger than we are, Kim. And the speaker who preceded me was a young woman named Karen, who had been at the rave party in Israel where the attack initially hit.
Oh, man.
She survived. She came. She spoke for about half an hour. Now, I sat there, and 100 people with nobody sitting down. Everybody was standing up. It was in a private home. We all were absolutely, I can only say, awestruck by this woman's courage, her ability to articulate.
Yeah.
And then I was given the task, when she was finished, of giving the follow-up. How do you follow up someone who is not just a victim, but a survivor? A survivor, because that's what she viewed herself as.
Mm-hmm.
She was lucky enough to be a survivor. Many of her friends were not. They were killed. And I think that is the dilemma we all face. But I'm glad that this is happening. I hope it leads to a more constructive situation. But I can assure everyone this is far from over. And by the way, you heard one of the Hamas officials said that when this is all done, we're going to do it again. And that to me is the most stunning thing of all. By the way, let me also indicate to you, and I think it's really important, the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council, which have condemned Israel repeatedly for what they are doing in Gaza, has not issued a single word of condemnation against
Yeah.
Hamas. Not a peep,
What
not a word.
what I understand is that there's going to be, or the hope is, that the ceasefire will continue as long as 10 hostages a day are released. So, is there a possibility that we could see more than 50
I
people
hope so.
released? Yeah.
I hope so. That's going to be the key. And the other thing is that everyone now will have to watch what Hamas does.
Hmm.
Israel did not initiate what happened on October 7th. It was a surprise attack against Israel. And all of Israel is waiting to see whether the hostages can be released. But let me assure you of one thing. No one will ever forget the 12 to 1400 people who were so brutally butchered. So, in the middle of rejoicing that some will be let go, there must also be the cognizant of why we are where we are. And again, I want to say a word about Joe Biden. If ever a president of the United States proved his mettle in the middle of a crisis, it's Joe Biden. He deserves the highest marks, as does Tony Blinken, for their diplomacy, their hard work, working with Qatar, working with Egypt in order to try to arrange something. And so I hope that no matter what you think of Joe Biden in terms of other policies, that he deserves the credit that he really does deserve for his actions during this crisis.
Can we talk about Susan Sarandon?
I hope so.
Because she has attended a couple of pro Palestinian rallies in recent weeks in New York City, and she said something that has now gotten her uh, in some trouble. She said, the quote is, "There are a lot of people that are afraid of being Jewish at this time, and they are getting a taste of how it feels to be Muslim in this country." Now, she might not be wrong because people that are Muslim in this country have been discriminated against probably even before the September 11th attacks, but certainly after that, right? I mean, the attacks against them went up. So I don't know if she's wrong, but the context in which she said it had the people at United Talent Agency, which represented her, saying, "No, thank you," which I think is their prerogative, right? If you're promoting someone, promoting their image, promoting their personality, promoting their likeness, and you don't like what they have to say or the message they're sending, and then it's completely your prerogative to say, "I can't represent you. I'm sorry, go find somebody else." But that's what they're doing. They're saying, "We can't, in light of recent comments that she made at this pro Palestinian rally, we can no longer represent her." So she's dropped. Do you think that was the right decision? Or do you think that people should be allowed their opinion on this and it shouldn't affect their employment, their representation, their livelihood?
People have a right to express their point of view. Susan Sarandon expressed her point of view. And I hope we're going to talk about Elon Musk as well. There is no doubt that they have a right, but there are consequences when you make statements.
Yep.
What she said not only offended the talent agency, but it offended many of her leading sponsors, including Disney, well, you can go down the list. You have the list in front of you. You pay consequences for what you say. And Susan Sarandon clearly expressed a point of view, appearing at a highly partisan rally.
Mm-hmm.
And all I can say is she is now paying the consequence, as will Elon Musk. I have never particularly liked Elon Musk. I respect his genius because there is a certain element of genius to what he does. But do I believe that the United States of America, our space program, should be more dependent on Elon Musk than we are on our own military? The answer is no, we shouldn't be. And that's something we will have to correct. Jew hatred, and you and I have talked about this in the past, is growing.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a myth. And although there's no doubt about the anti-Muslim prejudices which exist in this country, which we have heard, I must add, from leading Americans, in these last weeks and months, the hatred of Jews has grown to the point that, frankly, it's disturbing and startling. And I never thought in my life I would experience such a thing as I have been hearing and seeing. Even the hate mail I get, Kim,
Yeah.
I cannot begin to describe to you how we feel. This is not new. Uh, the J Weekly, which is the Jewish newspaper, and people can Google this, the story is up online, some years ago, did a story featuring Ron Owens, Michael Krasny, and John Rothmann as prominent, identifiable Jews who are
Right.
radio talk show hosts. And the hate we got, I mean, I can tell you, I've seen it, but it's now magnified
Hmm.
to the point that there was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle on the front page yesterday dealing with the rise of hate against Jews at the University of California and at Stanford University,
Yeah.
and the ambiguity because uh, evidently the administrations, many of them in these major colleges and universities, simply don't want to tackle it. But I can assure you of one thing: the Jewish community has been shaken to its very foundations by what we are witnessing on America's college campuses. And so this is another aspect. You talk about the Middle East conflict. The other night when I spoke about this to this group, I said it's not just what's happening on the ground in the Middle East. It's what's happening on the ground in Europe. It's what's happening on the ground in the United States. By the way, you know what? Macron, the president of France, banned pro-Palestinian demonstrations in France because they had turned so violent. I have to tell you, I've never been in favor of banning a demonstration. I believe in freedom of speech.
Hmm.
Somebody asked me, do you think when somebody chants from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? I said, well, of course it means the elimination of Israel. Of course it contains all of the elements of Jew hatred. But I answered, I'd rather have them chanting it out loud so I know who they are and where they are. But I felt the same thing, if I may be so bold as to say, when the Nazis, I don't call them Nazis, but when the American Nazis marched in Skokie, Illinois. And let me remind everybody,
Yeah.
Skokie in those days was heavily populated by Holocaust survivors. And the Nazis chose to march there. And there were a lot of people who said, ban them, stop them from marching. But I
Yeah.
supported very strongly the position of the ACLU, which said, no, let them march. Because you can only destroy hate and prejudice by exposing it to who we are. I heard you earlier playing a recording of what you heard on MSNBC,
Cassidy Hutchinson. Yeah.
and I was reminded of a series of lectures that Adlai Stevenson, twice the Democratic candidate for president in 52 and 56, delivered in a series of the Godkin lectures at Harvard University.
Hmm.
And he said the strength of America is not in its military might or in its economic might. The strength of America is in our ideas, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. It is our ideas which have which have frankly reframed the nature of the way the world operates. And so when you ask me, and I agree, I have to say completely with the statement by Cassidy Hutchinson, who I've never met but would enjoy interviewing.
Hmm.
Uh, I have to tell you, she's absolutely right. An assault on democracy,
Yeah.
no matter where it comes from, no matter whether it's from the far left or the far right, it has to be opposed. And by the way, Jew hatred is not the exclusive providence of the right, it's also the left. And we are witnessing that now. And to me, I would rather see these people have free speech, but know who they are. And I would rather have students on the campus exposed to it where there's a full discussion. What I regret to say is that a lot of our college administrators have the backbone of a chocolate eclair, and they're not willing to say what hate is. I can tell you during the George Floyd situation with Black Lives Matter, they had no hesitation about speaking out, nor did you, nor did I.
Hmm.
But when it comes to Jews, there seems to be a reluctance. And may I say that reluctance does not extend to the Muslim community. After September 11th, we were all vigorous in our
Right.
protestation on the question of Muslim rights in America. But for Jews, there seems to be, I don't know whether it's the inherent anti-Jewish feeling which has existed for 2,000 years and more, or whether it is simply something that bubbles under the skin of so many and pops out at a time like this. But I'm afraid. I'm afraid for our country. I'm afraid for Jews in this country. And I would be so bold as to say, as someone who is active and identified as a leader in the Jewish community, whatever that means, I'm afraid for my own safety. You know, it's
Sorry to
interesting. One
say,
last
I
point.
don't want you to go around being afraid.
No,
I
no.
have a question for you. I kind of want you to
Yeah,
clarify
I just want to say
something.
one thing. When I went to that event the other night
Mhm.
at a private home, they had security out in front. Can you
Wow.
imagine? They had security. They had a security guard there.
And they were
Anyway.
smart to do it. Yeah.
Yes.
Can we
What a
can we
shame.
can we go back to what Susan Sarandon said? Because I said I understand what she was trying to say. And that in and of itself, just me saying I understand her point, could be probably taken by some as anti-Semitic. So I want you to clarify for me what it is about what she said that rubs you or others that would not want to represent her anymore the wrong way. Is it where she said it and why she said it? Because what she said is that what you just mentioned, that there are people that are afraid of being Jewish at this time, right? They're Jewish and they're afraid for their safety. And that now they're getting a taste of how it feels to be Muslim in this country. Is it she's saying that now Jewish people are getting a taste of it as if Jewish people haven't always been discriminated against, as if they haven't always had to feel this? Is that what she's saying that's offensive? Or if you pick it apart, what is it that comes
First
out
of
to
all,
you?
it's where she said it.
Okay.
If Susan Sarandon had stood at the rally in Washington, D.C., with 300,000 Jews and non-Jews protesting against Jew hatred and against the tragic situation about Israel, I would have accepted that. But the place she chose to make her statement was in a place where people were calling for Israel's destruction. I mean, and although she made a comment about not discriminating against Jews, where she said it. And by the way, Albert, you can pull up the tape. You can hear her say it. You can see the people surrounding her. You can see the signs surrounding her. That was her problem. And that's why people from Disney, from talent agencies, from various industries have pulled their support for Susan Sarandon.
Right.
The same, I have to say, again, I go back to Elon Musk. I believe the same thing should be done to Elon Musk. But you know, the problem is, number one, people don't want to stand up to a celebrity. Number two, if you've got a lot of money, and Elon Musk has a lot of money, you don't want to stand up to Elon Musk in that way because people are afraid of offending people.
That's true. As I mentioned earlier, it seems like even if you don't mean it a certain way, no matter what you say, is going to be taken the wrong way by someone.
She didn't clarify it. She never made an effort after she made the statement, after sponsorships were pulled.
Right.
She didn't stand up and say, no, you misunderstand.
Well,
she didn't do that.
And it's again where she was and what the point of her saying it was, I believe. Right.
And let me point out to you, Elon Musk, who I don't believe at all, at least had the courage to say, well, you're misinterpreting what I said. At least he made a public statement along those lines, which the head of the Anti-Defamation League accepted. But, I'm very clear about this. She chose where she spoke. She could have spoken in Washington, D.C. at the rally for Israel and against Jew hatred. She could have chosen that forum. She didn't. She chose a forum in which people were chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Take a look at the images. I mean, you've got the photographs, and you actually can hear what she said. She says it in her own voice. That's what's disturbing, Kim. Her right to say it, I would defend, absolutely.
I had so many other things that I wanted to talk to you about today, but I'm glad that we had a chance to talk about JFK and to talk about what's going on in the Middle East. I can't thank you enough for being part of the Mark Thompson Show. You are amazing. I miss seeing your face and sitting across a desk from you every day. I really do, John Rothmann. I adore you.
And I miss you. And may I say, I miss your daughter especially.
Oh, yes.
Tell her and I don't know how many of you follow on Facebook, but Kim's son gave a piano recital, and I immediately responded to Kim saying, your retirement is secure. But Kim, I have a question for you for Thanksgiving. Kim once promised me a chocolate cream pie.
I never promised you the pie.
Oh, you
I
promised?
promised. Yes, I did. I promised you my husband might make the pie. That's true. That's true.
I want to know what you're serving for dessert at your Thanksgiving feast.
It's going to be a pumpkin pie, I think, is what it's going to be.
Okay.
And I might actually try to make it from scratch, boiling my own pumpkins and everything.
There's never been anything like this.
Right?
There's never been anything like this, and your talents are amazing. And please extend to your family and to your mother my warmest good wishes for a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
And I know you're taking the day off tomorrow, but Around the Political World with John Rothmann, I will
That's
record
the
in the morning.
podcast? Oh, you're going to do it tomorrow too?
I am. I'm
Awesome.
going to do it tomorrow. It's Thanksgiving,
Okay.
and I'm going to talk about some of the things we have to be thankful for, and who knows what else I'll talk about. But it's only 10 minutes, Monday through Friday. And Kim McAllister, may I say to you and to Albert and to Mark and to all of those associated with the Mark Thompson program, I am delighted to be with you every Wednesday. It means a lot to me, and thank you.
Thank you, John Rothmann. There's no place I'd rather be.
All right.
Happy
See you next
Thanksgiving,
week.
my friend. Bye.
Bye.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell, you'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.